This class we're calling it the real story of Hanukkah. A look into a little bit of what's really going on with the Hanukkah story beyond the miracle of the candles. And you should all have hopefully a text sheet that I'm going to share online for everyone as well. It'll be up on the screen and I'll kind of work us through it. We should have closed captioning on to make sure that everyone can hear properly, can communicate properly and follow along. And just want to acknowledge the diversity of our group in terms of ability and everything else. It's so wonderful to have such a diverse community here with us. So why don't we tuck right in, unless I'm forgetting everything. Let's begin with our prayer for the study of Torah. Jordan, is that something you can put up on the screen for us? And if not, I can grab it quickly.
You grab it?
No problem.
I don't have it, Rabbi.
No problem. Okay. Oh, hold on. All right, here we go. Hopefully you can all see that okay. Nice and big. There we go. Please join with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who tells us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. All right. And let's maybe we could very quickly, if it's not too hard, I'd love to just know everyone in the room because it's harder for me to see. I can see everyone online pretty well, but maybe we could quickly go around and folks could just introduce themselves. We can start in the front row. I see maybe with Andrew there, and then work our way around. I think we're okay without the mic. If you just want.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Kleeman. Happy to be here.
I'm Alice Sales.
Len Sales. Bill Smith.
Ruth Smith.
Steve Crane.
Elaine Crane.
Good morning, Beverly Sherman.
Jerry Silverman. Terry Silver. Mike Houghton.
Sudaku.
Mark Levinsky.
Ellen Foster.
Howard Green.
All right. And online we have Chuck and Roger, Susanna, Marcia, Rosalie, Banya, Bonnie, Batya, Neil, twice, Ben Sion, or Neil once, Jeffrey, Saunders, Ben Sion, Jordan, Joel, Kara, Harriet, Laura, and Natalie. What a great crew. All right. Wonderful group. All right. I'm going to share my screen and we are going to tuck right into a little bit of Hanukkah. So before I do, and before you all look at your pieces of paper, who knows the Hanukkah story? Anyone here know it from what you learned as a kid?
Rabbi, did you say pieces? Rabbi, can I ask you a question? Did you say
please.
Pieces of paper? Was there a handout?
Yeah, I'm gonna share the screen for everyone online.
Oh,
So
okay.
you'll see it. And for everyone in the room, you should have a text sheet. But before we look at that, before I give away the answer, who can just very quickly, who knows the story of Hanukkah? Who can tell it to us in like 2 sentences? Steve? Is that you raising your hand?
Yes.
At least the way you know
I
it.
have from two sources, one of which is a very famous book, which I read a very long time ago, about the Maccabees. Maccabees, which is the correct pronunciation, by the way?
Maccabbean.
It depends on if you're going for the Hebrew or the English. In Hebrew, it would probably be Maccabee, but we tend to anglicize it and say Maccabee, like Torah versus Torah.
Okay. Well, the Syrian Greeks, which are the remnant of Alexander, suppressed the Jewish community by wanting to install not only the Greek culture, but the pagan religion. A lot of the Jews wanted to be assimilated, our constant problem. And the Maccabees, I said it wrong again, I think.
Maccabbean.
They said none of this, and they revolted with a maybe the first type of the guerrilla warfare approach, and they defeated the Syrians, which probably gave them a false idea that they could later defeat the Romans, but that's another story.
That's another story. I love that, Steve. And then the key part that we tell all the kids, they got to the temple, the menorah, right, that we have in the 7-branch menorah that represents the 7 days of the week in Shabbat. Famously, you've probably seen that if you've ever been to Rome and you've been to Titus's Arch. We have it in our own sanctuary on either sides of the ark is the original menorah. The 7-branch menorah was out, right? It was normally lit with oil. And of course, the famous story, there wasn't enough oil. It was only enough for one night, and the oil lasted 8 nights. Hanukkah's 8 nights. That's a beautiful story. And we all lived happily ever after. So as Steve already kind of alluded to, there's a little more to it than that. And as Susanna said, if you ever watch the Rugrats Hanukkah special at Classic, tells the story pretty well. So let's share my screen here. And the first question I want to ask, which will really help us to understand a little more of what was going on with Hanukkah, is why is Hanukkah 8 days? So the story we all know, one possible reason, at least what we've all been taught, is the miracle of the oil. This story, the miracle of the oil, which is the first text on your sheet, comes from the Talmud. The Talmud was written by the rabbis. This section of the Talmud, which is part of the Gemara, which is the later part of it, was written between roughly the years 400 and 600, although the first part of the Talmud, the Mishnah, where we first kind of see some of this, was written in the first, second century CE of the Common Era in Israel. This is the very first mention we have in any canonical Jewish source, meaning like part of our official books, that talks about the miracle of the oil. The Hanukkah story itself happened roughly 167 BCE. This story was written at some point many hundreds of years later, as late as possibly 400 or 500 years later. Marcia's not seeing the shared screen. Are others seeing the shared screen? Everyone else can see it?
You see it in the room.
Marcia, you might want to try clicking. Maybe there's a button on your thing that says something like switch shared screen versus presenter or something like that. I'm going to stop the share for a second and I'll reshare it. Hold on.
When it's being shared, up at the top, there's a view options. You should be able to click on that and then choose something different.
See if that helps you out, Marcia. Okay.
No worries. I'm used to sharing with screens, so I'll figure it out.
So this is, now, if you'll notice, the Talmud is made up of 72 tractates. There's tractates for many of the different holidays. There's a tractate called Yoma, which is all about Yom Kippur. There's a tractate called Rosh Hashanah, that's all about Rosh Hashanah. There's a tractate called Pesachim, that's all about Pesach, about Passover. There is no tractate in the Talmud called Hanukkah or anything like that. So where do we find the story of Hanukkah? As you'll see, we actually find it in the tractate of Shabbat. And if you were to go a couple of paragraphs before this, you'd see that the rabbis are in this ridiculous conversation about wicks and about candles and about lighting and all this stuff. And they're talking about Shabbat candles. And then someone says, oh, but what about Hanukkah candles? And what about Hanukkah wicks? And then out of nowhere, the Gemara asks, my Hanukkah, what is Hanukkah? As if no one even knows what this holiday is. And so they're going on this great tangent. So can I have a volunteer either online or in the room who wants to read for us what is Hanukkah according to the Talmud in Shabbat 21b?
Elaine.
All right, go for it, please.
Okay. Why is Hanukkah 8 days? Miracle of the oil. Shabbat 21b10.
The Gemara asks, what is Hanukkah and why are lights kindled on Hanukkah? The Gemara answers, the sages taught in Megillat Ta'anit on the 25th of Kislev
Yep.
The days of Hanukkah are 8. One may not eulogize on them, and one may not fast on them. What is the reason? When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious over them, they searched and found only one cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest, undisturbed by the Greeks. And there was sufficient oil there to light the candelabrum for only 1 day. A miracle occurred, and they lit the candelabrum from it 8 days. The next year, the sages instituted those days and made them holidays with recitation of Hallel and special thanksgiving in prayer and blessings.
All right. Thank you, Elaine. So this is our first. So what is Hanukkah? It's on the 25th. And people always ask, when's Hanukkah? You know, when's Hanukkah this year? When's Hanukkah this year? And I say, it's the same time every year, 25th of Kislev. It's an awful joke. Of course, our Hebrew calendar moves around, but Hanukkah is always on the 25th of Kislev, as historically this was the day when this miracle happened. It's traditionally a celebration, so we traditionally don't do fasts, which is why maybe this was first mentioned in Megillat Ta'anit, which is a tractate all about fasts. Steve did a very nice job of just explaining when it says when the Greeks entered the sanctuary. We often call them Greeks. I'll just tell you a quick story. I was at Hebrew school years ago on Sunday morning, our Berkman Merkaz Limud, and I kept talking about the evil Greeks and how they invaded the temple and defiled it. And this one girl starts crying. And I was like, oh no, what did I do? And she says, my dad's from Greece. Oh my God, was he this horrible person? Did he do this? Does this make me? So again, from now on, I never say Greeks, and I always say the Hellenized Assyrian Seleucid Empire. But Steve did tell us, Steve Crane did say it very well, but we often use Greeks as a shorthand, and we'll talk more about that. But and actually, I think in the Hebrew of the Talmud, they do use Greeks. Yevanim is the word for Greeks, but really, we're not talking about people from Greece. We're talking about, it's Hellenization that we're talking about. And if we think about, roughly 300 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedonia, who's not even Greek technically, he's Macedonian, but he's Hellenistic, conquers sort of the known world of where we're talking about at the time. And really, his major thing was he spread Hellenistic Greek culture throughout this land. Upon his death, his empire is divided into 3 main kingdoms. The 2 that are most important to us are the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt and the Assyrian Seleucid kingdom, which is up by Babylon, Syria, north and sort of east of Israel. And if you think Israel is sort of caught in the middle between, and this is the history of Israel for thousands of years, was often caught in the middle between 2 major powers in Egypt and in sort of the Near East. But these Greeks, these Assyrian Seleucids come in, and King Antiochus IV, they defile the temple, and they're only found 1 cruse of this oil that had the seal on it, right? When you're opening a jar and it pops and you know that it was undisturbed, it's safe. There was only 1 jar that was sealed like that, that had been sort of kosher to use for lighting the menorah. It was only supposed to last for 1. It lasted for 8, and there we go. And then we celebrate it with Hallel and Thanksgiving prayers. And there's special prayers we traditionally do on Hanukkah, including Al Hanisim, a prayer for all the miracles, as well as Hallel, which is a series of psalms that we chant. So this is one story, and I say real, it could all be real. This is one possible story. What is interesting about this story is that, as I said, the first time we see this recorded is in Shabbat 21b in the Gemara. We never see this in earlier texts. And so we might ask, was this a creation of the rabbis? If this story was never written in any of the historical books, and there are historical books at that time, could there have been other reasons why we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days. So I want to look at a couple other possibilities, and it'll help sort of inform us in thinking about the holiday a little bit. Let me ask first questions about this text from the Gemara, from the Talmud, about why Hanukkah is 8 days. This is probably the one we're most familiar with. All right, and feel free to interrupt at any point. Oh yeah, yeah?
And so are the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, are they the same?
The same people, yeah. So the Hasmonean, the Hashmani in Hebrew, the Hasmonean dynasty is a group of, and they're actually, they're part of the priesthood in Israel. They're high priests, descended from Aaron, part of that same priestly group. They become both the priestly and the ruling class of Israel. The Maccabees are part of the Hasmoneans. Kind of think about the Hasmonean as ultimately the dynasty that takes over. The Maccabees are like the army of the Hasmoneans. Yeah, Alice.
So this has nothing to do with the 8 days. So if you want me to hold the question.
No, go for it.
Was this mainly a fight between the Jews who wanted to be assimilated and the Jews who wanted to be Greek? Or have Greek
So I think
culture?
that's really important, and we'll get into that a little more, but I'm happy to talk about it now because I think it's important for us to understand this, that this was not just an outside invading army. There clearly was an outside army that came in, and that was probably the impetus for the battle. But this was a long process of Hellenization that was going on, and Greek culture was really popular at the time. If you think about it, it's honestly not that dissimilar to what's happening in America today. We are constantly sort of battling at Rosh Shalom with the forces of American society. And I don't know if battling is the right word, but where people love the opera, people love the ballet, people love Philadelphia sports teams. And it is a struggle, right? On a Sunday morning, we think, oh, we're ready to teach Hebrew school, and only half the kids show up because the Eagles have a really big game and they're going to win, right? And we get that secular culture is really appealing and it's wonderful. And so this was the same thing in Israel. And what you saw was really the Hasmoneans were much more sort of the hardline fundamentalists, the Maccabees, and the Greek sort of Hellenized Jews that really took on Greek culture, were much more like what we might call sort of assimilated Jews in America, who say, I'm not really religious, but I still do this one little thing. And what you're really seeing much more of in the Hanukkah story is a civil war, in a sense, between a sort of fundamentalist stream of Judaism and a assimilated stream of Judaism. And if the Greek Jews had sort of won out, one wonders if Judaism would have even continued. They weren't circumcising their children, they weren't teaching Torah, they were really into all Greek literature. And yet, if it had been totally, and we'll get into this more, if the Maccabees had totally won out completely, Judaism would not be what it is today, because so much of Judaism has been influenced by Greek thought. And we see that, I would say, as a positive. For instance, the best example I like to give is the Passover Seder. If you ever read Plato's Symposium, a symposium, the word symposium in Greek means a drinking feast. And what do you do at a Greek symposium? Think about the Socratic method. What's the Socratic method? You ask questions to try to arrive at a deeper truth. You recline. The ancient Greeks used to lean on their left and only drink with their right hand. These are all the things that we do at a Passover Seder. It is so Greek. And so there were many elements in later Jewish thought, and especially rabbinic thought, that leaned on Hellenistic ideas and Greek philosophy. So we'll get into that a little more, but I love it. It's a great question. It's sort of a bit more of the picture. So let's look at the second possible reason as to why it was 8 days. This is from Rabbi Paul Steinberg, and then there's a text that sort of explains it a little more. Does someone want to read why maybe it was 8 days, another possible reason?
Go ahead, Alex. Alex, go ahead.
Go for it.
Rabbi Paul Steinberg. Is this the purification of the dead?
Exactly.
Beyond any symbolic explanations for the number 8 lies some more practical, concrete, or commemorative explanations. One rabbinic tradition says that the Hasmoneans may have needed 8 days to become purified after being in contact with the dead on the battlefield. Purification consisted of being sprinkled with clean water that had been mixed with the ashes of an unblemished sacrificial red heifer. The sprinkling would have occurred on days number 3 and 7, and only the next day could the Hasmoneans, now ritually cleansed, produce a new batch of purified oil. Another explanation, the one heard more often, claims simply that it took 8 days to obtain olives and crush them into oil.
And I put this text here from Numbers just to understand what Rabbi Steinberg's talking about, that these are texts of, if he who touches the corpse of any human being shall be unclean for 7 days. They shall bathe on the 3rd and 7th, and then finally on the 8th day, they're clean. So another explanation for why 8 days, it still could have been that they couldn't get the oil until that, and the oil still could have lasted for those days up until that. But what's interesting is, and you'll see where this comes from more, that they make no reference of any of the military or the dead or the purification in this Hanukkah story, right? According to the Hanukkah story from Shabbat. But when we get Paul Steinberg, there's a Rabbi Paul Freedman, Paul Steinberg makes clear that maybe the reason had more to do with this battle, and that these were, remember, these are holy priests, but they've also just literally been in a physical military battle where they clearly would have come into contact with the dead and therefore couldn't enter the sanctuary because they were ritually impure. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Or thoughts? And if you're raising your hand in the room, I can't really see. Okay, let's move on to this third text, the third possible reason why it could be 8 days. And I kind of gave away what it is, but it's a delayed Sukkot. This is from the Book of Maccabees. The Book of Maccabees is not in the Jewish canon. Remember, a canon is a set, sort of closed set of texts. The Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is a canon. The Hebrew Bible is different from the Old Testament, and this is one of those ways it's different. During and we'll get into this a little more, during the Second Temple period and beyond, the Hebrew Bible was being canonized. It was a long process. The Torah as a set, those first 5 books, that's been like that for a long time, probably at least since the return of the exiles in 515 BCE. But the Tanakh, the full Bible, as we know it, the full Hebrew Bible, similar to the Old Testament, not the same thing, the full Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, really wasn't canonized until quite late. We actually have a debate, for instance, in the Talmud around, in the Mishnah specifically, around Purim and around the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther is in the canon, in the Hebrew Bible, but the rabbis actually debate whether it should be included or not. This is an aside, but any idea why they might say Esther shouldn't have been included? What is it, Susanna, do you know?
It's because God is never mentioned in the Book of Esther, and because there's
exactly right.
Origins.
Exactly right. So it's one of these later books. And it never, God is not mentioned once in the entire book. So the rabbis say, is it even a holy book? Does it even contain holiness in it if it doesn't have God's name? And therefore they debate. Ultimately, they decide it is a holy book because they say God is there. God's just hidden, right? And actually, if you think about Hester, Panim, it means a hidden face. The name Esther also means hidden. And there's a lot of hidden faces and sort of behind masks. And they say actually the line when Mordecai says to Esther, this is like the best line, right? When Esther says, who am I to go before the king? And Mordecai says, it's exactly you. Maybe, Esther, you attained this royal position just for a moment like this. They say that's God. That's the moment where God is there. We just don't name God in that way. So the Book of Maccabees is a historical book. There are actually 4 books of Maccabees. The first 2 are the most historical, Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. They were most likely written originally in Hebrew. We can tell that based on the language, although we have yet to find any Hebrew manuscripts of it. The only versions we have of Maccabees are the Greek translations. The whole entire Tanakh was translated into Greek early on because everyone was speaking Greek, and it was the first sort of language it was translated into, known as the Septuagint. Because supposedly there were 70 elders who all looked at the translation and they all wrote it, and it was the exact same and it matched up. So therefore it was perfect. There are many problems with the Septuagint in terms of its translation. But the Book of Maccabees is a historical book. It ultimately was not included in the Jewish canon, and we'll get more into that. And that has to do with more of the larger issues going on. But it is fairly historical, and it tells the Hanukkah story in I think, a very different way. And this is some of what Steve was referring to. So who wants to read for us from 2nd Maccabees, the text here?
Howard.
All right, go for it.
Okay. The sanctuary was purified on the 25th of Kislev, the same day of the same month as that on which foreigners had profaned it. The joyful celebration lasted for 8 days, like the Feast of Tabernacles. And then they recalled how, only a short time before, they had kept that feast while living like wild animals in the mountains and caves. So carrying garlanded wands and flowering branches, as well as palm fronds, they chanted hymns to the one who so triumphantly achieved the purification of his own temple.
So thank you, Marcia. The Feast of Tabernacles, we call this something different. We call this Sukkot. I don't know why this is just a translation, but sometimes called the Festival of Booths, a booth, a tabernacle, a sukkah. So if you think about it, it's not, what Sukkot was maybe, what are we going on, maybe 60 days ago or something like that. They've been fighting for over a year, and they had missed Sukkot. And so they decided that they were basically celebrating a delayed Sukkot. What did they have? Palm fronds. What do we call those? Lulav, right? What do we do in Sukkot traditionally? We chant Hallel, hymns. And how long is Sukkot? 8 days. And I'll say, by the way, that Sukkot, unlike some of our other holidays, which are Passover 7 days in the Torah, and then we add a day, Sukkot is actually 8 days in the Torah, or it's 7 plus Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day. So that's not one of those ones that it gets longer. It becomes like 9 days in the diaspora, but it is biblically 8 days traditionally. And so according to Maccabees, there's no mention of the oil. It had nothing to do with a purification or anything like that. And the reason was, it was a delayed Sukkot celebration. Thoughts, questions about that? That's their hand up, yeah.
You and I have discussed this a lot over the years, and you know how I feel about this, so, but they may not, so. So in the Book of Maccabees, there are lots and lots of references to something called the Camping Out Festival, which has to be Sukkot. And they didn't have sacrifices for, I believe it was 3 years. And according to the Bible, when they dedicated the Holy Temple the first time, they used animal sacrifices. And the first day, it's 13 bullocks, the next day, 12 bullocks, and so on, for 8 days, because Sukkot was an 8-day holiday. And until the time of Hillel Shammai, they might have been lighting 8 candles, then 7, then 6. By the time of Hillel Shammai, in the 100s, 200s, there was a debate and Shammai said we should light the candles 876, just like the bullocks went down. And Hillel said, no, we have a concept in Judaism called Marbimus Simcha, which means we increase in joy, we don't decrease in joy. So we start with 1 and then with 8 with all the light. And there's another concept called Occam's razor, which is if you have 2 choices for an explanation, the simpler one is probably the right one. So if it's a miracle where oil lasted for 8 days, or they celebrated Sukkot and all the other things I just said seem to make perfect sense, I vote for Sukkot.
I'm with you, Jerry. I like Occam's razor too, and it seems to sort of make sense. But we'll get a little more into the power of that oil. I just want to, Alice, I'm going to call on you 1 second. I just want to make sure everyone understands what Jerry said there, and just add a little bit that one of my favorite texts that when I work with wedding couples, I always teach this, and it's the rabbis teaching Pirkei Avot, that there are 2 types of arguments in this world. You guys have heard me say this a lot: an argument for the sake of heaven and an argument not for the sake of heaven. And the argument not for the sake of heaven is the example of Korach and Moses. And when Korach rebelled against Moses in the desert, he did it for his own glory, his own ego. It was about he wanted to be in charge. A dispute like Hillel and Shammai is what they call an argument for the sake of heaven. And I talk about this for couples, but it works for friends, for anyone in a community, that we should be like Hillel and Shammai. We should always have arguments for the sake of heaven. And that argument about Hanukkah candles is actually one of their best arguments, because they both have very good reasons, right? Shammai says we start with 8, we work our way down to 1, corresponding to the sacrifices of the bulls that took place during that time. Some say also corresponding to the oil that decreased, if you're going to think about it that way. Hillel says our light should increase, so our joy should increase, and we go up from 1 to 8. Neither one is right, but they're both right, but we ultimately choose one. And they're not arguing out of ego or anything like that. They're both just trying to figure out the best way for the Jewish people to celebrate a holiday. And I think if we remember in all of our arguments with our family and friends, if we root ourselves in a machlochet l'shem shamayim, an argument for the sake of heaven, and we remember that it's not about who's right or wrong, it's not about our ego, but it's about, we're all just trying to figure out the best way to do this for our family. That's what's important. Alice.
So I'm trying to get the timeline straight or something. So there definitely historically was a rebellion against the Seleucid. Am I saying right?
100%. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we don't exactly know when, or we do know when.
No,
and it was
167. Yeah, and the dating, 25th of Kislev, it began. No, we have a pretty, 167 to 164 was the war. Yeah.
So, but it's also at the shortest day of the year, kind of around that time. And there's always been a pagan winter holiday. I think I've read about that.
I think you are.
Christians have Christ.
Yep.
Being born on Christmas. So who's copying who? Are we all copying the pagans, and is there really historical?
So I think so it's historical in terms of the years. The dating of the purification and the war, we know from the Book of Maccabees. How accurate that is hard to say. The historian Josephus, who was also writing at that time, also dates it at that time. So one could say it is possible that it's just coincidental. Alternatively, it could be very much like what they did in Christianity. If the historical Jesus did exist, we're not 100% sure, but let's say he did, not as the Son of God, but just as a person. Most likely he was born in the summer, is what most scholars think. Christians moved the birth of Jesus to this time to coincide with pagan holidays around the solstice. It's entirely possible that happened in Judaism as well. We don't have a lot of particular evidence one way or the other, is what I'd say. But we do know that other Jewish holidays began more rooted in pagan agricultural festivals and then took on later Jewish themes with them. For example, if we think about Passover, for instance, before it was ever a holiday around the Exodus, it was simply an agricultural holiday around the harvest. And it was the time of the harvest. Sukkot was the time of the wheat harvest. These existed for a long time before they became religious holidays associated with the Exodus and the giving of Torah. And so it's possible is the answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I want to just pick up on a couple more things here in this text of Maccabees, and maybe going back to a little bit of what Steve said at the start, which was very helpful. And I've always loved this, and I chose this text because it said only a short time before they had kept their feast, right? So they had done the feast of Sukkot while living like wild animals in mountains and caves. And Steve said this was probably one of the first ever guerrilla warfares. And I want to say something a little bit, maybe pushing a little, and I just to kind of push us a little, and to say, what if we were to equate the Maccabees with a group like the Taliban? And I want you to think about that for a second, right? You have a group of, and I say this partly because I used to have a T-shirt, I wish I still had it, from the 1980s that my cousin gave me, that says, it's like a pro-US T-shirt, and it says like an anti-communism thing, and it says, support the Afghan freedom fighter. He fights for you. In the 1980s, the Afghan freedom fighters, who are we talking about?
Taliban.
The Taliban. The US supported the Taliban against Soviets, against communism in Soviet Russia, right? In the USSR. The idea, if you're just to play around with, we think of the Maccabees as these wonderful heroes. And again, I want to be fair, without the Maccabees, we might all be Greek today and worshiping Dionysus. I mean, it wouldn't be so bad. But the Maccabees were fundamentalists. They wanted pure Judaism. And they really were, if you think of them, living like wild animals in mountains and caves, fighting a guerrilla warfare. After the Maccabees took control, they instituted a very harsh rule. Again, compared to the Taliban, right? They took over immediately. Women stopped going to school, all these really awful things that come from fundamentalism. And we have some of this from a historical record. One of the things they did was they forcibly circumcised uncircumcised Jews. So imagine you're really into Greek culture. You love there's a lot of naked wrestling, the baths, all that good stuff. The uncircumcised penis is in. It's the thing those days. So there are all these Jews not circumcising. The Maccabees then forcibly circumcised them after they took control. Similarly, there was a group of people, the Edomites, who had lived for a very long time in Israel among the Jews. When the Maccabees took control, they came to the Edomites and they basically said, similar to what the Spanish did for us during the Inquisition and the Portuguese, they said to the Edomites, convert, leave, or die. What we know from an archaeological record is that the Edomites, for the most part, fled and they left Israel. They did not want to convert. And they did not want to live under Maccabean rule. They didn't want to die. We know this because there's actually an amazing archaeological site called Beit Guvrin, which you can visit if you go to Israel. And maybe we'll take a congregational trip. I'm planting a seed there. I know we have a few that are interested in that next year or in the coming years, where we'll get to go to this place called We Dig Israel. And I've been there with our teens. And what you are digging at is actually an old Edomite settlement. And one of the reasons it's an amazingly archaeological preserved site is because when the Edomites left, they didn't want the Maccabees to get to have their stuff. They destroyed their own houses and cisterns and basically caved them in. And it actually preserved a beautiful archaeological record of the Edomite village. And so the Maccabees were pretty harsh. And it really was a pretty harsh military victory that was going on. Again, at the same time, without them, we might not have Judaism today. So I want to look at this last text. This is Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who, let me actually, before I get there, questions or thoughts about any of that? Yeah, who is that I'm having trouble seeing.
Right. My question is it kind of like what's going on in Israel right now with the extreme Haredi announcing that Jews who are not Haredi may not be considered Jews?
So I think it is a great point. I think there's real concern right now in Israel around aspects of this new government. that are pretty far right. And in terms of not getting into sort of the issue of Palestinians necessarily, but the issue of, first of all, just Arab Israelis. There are those that say in the government that Arab Israelis who are Israeli citizens, 20% of the population, they've lived in Israel their whole lives. They are Israeli citizens. They are not Palestinians. They do not live in the West Bank. They live in Israel. There is a lot of vitriol against them, that they should have to, sign loyalty waivers and different things like that. Similarly, we're also seeing a real push against progressive Judaism right now in Israel, and amongst this far right. And I think it's worrying. I think it's worrying for many of us as to sort of the religious freedoms in Israel. And what ends up happening, unfortunately, in Israel is the sort of main right-wing bloc of sort of, Likud, Netanyahu's party, which is center-right, is not antagonistic towards progressive Jews and actually tries to have good relations with the majority of the rest of the world, which are progressive Jews. Yet they sort of make a deal with the devil in a sense, and in order to have their coalition, in order to get those 61 seats in the Knesset to have a ruling party, they join with these far right and give them more power really than they actually have in Israel. And that's one of the problems with a parliamentary system, with sort of the kingmaker, that these fringe right-wing parties end up getting control of religion because, Netanyahu and most of sort of his base don't really care that much about that. It's not their main issue. They're worried more about security, rightfully so. And for them, they say, okay, vote with us on everything else and we'll let you control religion. You can handle it. And so I think, I think that is, I don't think it's anywhere near the extreme that we saw in the time of the Maccabees. But I think, in talking with some of my progressive colleagues over in Israel, I think there is some fear around, funding, for instance. Currently, they've worked really hard to make sure Reform synagogues can get state funding, just like Orthodox ones. That was a hard-fought battle in the Supreme Court in Israel, and they're worried about that being turned back. So that's an example. Yeah. Steve.
I have a little theory. I know the headline is how Jews were being assimilated by Greeks, but I would like to submit that they were heavily influencing Greek thought.
Going the other way around.
Yeah, to some extent.
Yeah.
After the Egyptians, Akhenaten, had one idol rather than many, namely the sun, the Greeks and even the Romans started to say, well, Zeus is the chief one. There is only one God, and all the others are like assistants, sort of like the empire and his governor. And then I think even later, I haven't quite explored this yet, they started to say, well, Zeus or some other idol actually gave us some laws. So I think the Jewish idea was permeating throughout the world as well, even though we never get credit for it, as the opposite.
I love that, Steve. I don't know enough about sort of the history of Greek thought to speak intelligently on it, but I love that idea. It makes a lot of sense. And I've always been a fan of Thomas Cahill's book, The Gift of the Jews, which looks at sort of the ideas that Judaism gave to Western civilization. And maybe that would touch on some of that if folks are interested. But we always think about the Greek influence on Judaism in that positive way and sort of don't think about it the other way. So I would venture to say, and sort of getting to the end a little bit with this last text, that, the rabbis were heavily influenced by the Greek thought, which I think is perhaps part of the reason they do not put as much of an emphasis on the military battle or on the assimilation civil war pieces of it. But I really like Arthur Waskow's sort of take on this. Arthur Waskow is he's actually a local rabbi here in Philadelphia who does a lot of environmental work with the Shalom Center, wonderful, wonderful teacher. And this is from his book, Seasons of Joy, which is a classic that's all about the Jewish holidays. Does someone want to read this piece as to sort of what he thinks the reason why? All right, Stephanie, go for it.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. The reason is that the rabbis were not happy. Oh, you moved it.
Sorry, I'm trying to make it bigger.
You moved it. were not happy with the Maccabean approach to Jewish life. They were writing in the period when similar revolts against Rome, seeking to win the Jews' political independence, to turn Judea into a rocky fortress, and to toughen the Jewish people, had been systematically and brutally smashed by the iron fist of Rome. Only the rabbinical kind of power, the power not of rock, but water, fluid and soft from moment to moment, and yet irresistible over the long run, had survived. Only the rabbinical kind of power had protected and preserved Jewish peoplehood.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. The Maccabean dynasty was very short. It lasted, Steve, what was it? I want to say maybe 80 years or something, not even. And it was, and very quickly afterwards, Rome came in. This was not some amazing, kingdom that lasted for hundreds, thousands of years. And ultimately, the rabbis are writing immediately after it's, the famous story is with the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, that, and finally after the fall of Beitar, one of the last revolts, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the great rabbis of the time, actually gets smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin. So literally like dies to be reborn, where he ends up gathering at Yavne, I think it's near like Lod Airport, near Ben Gurion Airport. And he gathers with the sages and they begin to write the Mishnah and basically figure out how Judaism is going to continue. And you can understand why they didn't want to put emphasis on that military battle, because they had just lost and they realized it didn't look good. And they had realized that, perhaps by retelling the story, by making it more about God's power, by making it more about a miracle, by transforming this into a narrative that perhaps was never meant to be read historically, that they could create a new narrative for what Judaism is, and understand they weren't going to have political independence, and that if they were to be a people that were going to live in the diaspora and have to deal with assimilation and all this, that this was the message of the miracle, the message of the oil would be the message that would help patch them through. Thoughts on Waskow's sort of take on that, on why, and Jerry, what do you think?
I want to quote from our prayer book. This is Mishkan Tefillah for festivals, page 292 for Hanukkah. And I'll read just the English translation. And this is the only thing that we basically read on Hanukkah in our prayer book. In the days of the Hasmoneans, Mattathias ben Yochanan, the high priest, and his children, when the evil government of Greece rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and to make them leave the laws of your will, in your great mercy, you rose up with them in their time of trouble and fought in their fight, judged their cause just. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the unclean into the hands of the pure, the evil into the hands of the righteous, and the arrogant into the hands of those who engage in your Torah. For you made a great and holy name in your world, and for your people Israel, you brought about the great triumph and redemption on that very day. And when your children came to the Holy of Holies and emptied your temple and purified your holy place and lit candles in your holy courts and established these 8 days of Hanukkah, grateful to acknowledge and to praise your great name. No miracle mentioned. Interesting. That important, I think that they would include it. And I would hope that someday in the future, when you ask anybody, especially kids, Hebrew school, why do we celebrate Hanukkah? I hope that the first thing they say is that we fought for our religion, not because oil burned for 8 days.
I love that. And let me ask you, Jerry, just to ask a little more, why is that important? Why is it important that that's what kids will say?
Well, because I think that miracles are things that, people like to have. Christianity certainly has its share of miracles. And I think that sticks with people, even though they're not necessarily true or not even remotely true. But it's more fun. It's more fun to have a miracle than to come up with this, scientific, historical explanation. And I think that a lot of us just stay with that. And I think it's really important to learn the real reason for Hanukkah, like today. So thank you.
I love that. I love that. Who sat in the back? Is that Howard?
So I came because I hope you could set me straight on something and you're moving forward. You're not there yet. If you posit that the Maccabees were in fact Taliban-like, which I've been losing friends for 20 years saying, and that there was at least a three-way struggle underway. And that among the people, the Maccabees went after are in fact the ancestors of our tradition.
Yeah.
People who become the Pharisees.
Yep, exactly.
So when we have elevated Hanukkah in the pantheon of holidays which American Jews celebrate, we are in fact commemorating the people who wanted to put us out of business.
It's interesting, Howard. Yes, on one hand, and when we learn the real story of Hanukkah and we talk about this, we're also elevating those Hellenistic Jews that were forgotten about, right? And that's why we tell the real story. So I think you're right. When we
send into the Hellenistic,
that's exactly, and you're exactly right. If you look at, if you think about kind of, and I used to have a chart where I kind of wrote it out this way, that you have the Hellenistic Jews and the Hasmoneans, Maccabees. And then in sort of that next generation, you then have the Sadducees, who are controlling the temple, who are the ancestors of the Hasmonean Maccabees, and the Pharisees, who are the ancestors of those Hellenistic Jews who believe crazy things like resurrection of the dead, which was, not something the Sadducees believed, but came from Greek ideas. And they later become the rabbis. The Pharisees are the proto-rabbis. You're exactly right, that we are the descendants, in a sense, of those Hellenistic Jews. And so I think when we tell it this way, and I love what Jerry said, let's tell it as the full story to our kids, then we realize what a beautiful story, actually, that I think it's a story that ultimately the real miracle of Hanukkah is that these different factions were able to come together, and through both of them, Judaism survived. And in a sense, what it tells me is that we need our entire Jewish community. And we need both those ideas that come from the outside. And at the same time, we do need to be mindful of assimilation, and that we do need those that are going to keep the religion strong. And that in every generation, we have to find that balance, right, as to where that is. And the real sort of miracle, a sense of Hanukkah, is that the Jewish people are still here, and that we're continuing to struggle with this both in Israel and in America and in our own lives, even, as to that balance of assimilation versus fundamentalism. But you're right, Howard. If we purely, all day, Judah Maccabee, yay, Hasmoneans, yay, we are essentially just talking about people that would have killed us way back when and wouldn't have been happy with us. So it's a careful balance, I think. But I love that you brought that point up. Steve?
I'd like to link a little bit Hanukkah to one of the last speeches of Moses, when he gave us instructions how to maintain our religion. It wasn't called Judaism then, but essentially, if I remember correctly, he said you have to be different and you have to separate yourself. And that's what the Maccabees did. Maybe a more harsh method, but sometimes you overcompensate.
I think you're right, and it's that balance. I think the Maccabees definitely went too hard, and yet I always say again, if it hadn't been for the Maccabees, don't know if Judaism would still be around today, and that's a simple fact. And so I think it's that balance. Yeah, Alice.
Once I went to a Hanukkah celebration, and I'm curious about whether this is a distortion or whether it can fit in. The story was described as a victory for a minority, and therefore it's a holiday celebrating the importance and the rights of minorities. And that's because you have to have a simple message for children. And I was very surprised about that message, because I thought, oh, I never heard it that way. But is that completely off?
It's a good question. I don't know who the majority. I don't know who the majority minority was in this sort of civil war. What percentage of Israelites were Hellenized? What percentage were more fundamental? It's hard to say. I don't know if I would use that line. That wouldn't be the main theme that I would lift up necessarily, but it could work maybe.
But what simple message can you give to children? I mean, they can't get into all this detail.
I think you can, in a very simple way, get into that message of assimilation versus fundamentalism. We're using big words, but I think there are ways to explain to kids the power of keeping our traditions, but also being open to the outside world. And that would be the simplistic way of saying it, right? And that's sort of a constant, an us-them sort of thing, which exists a lot in this world. And to me, that would be the overriding message of Hanukkah is finding that balance. Yeah.
Good, thank
I want
you.
to say something. I think there is a saying that Israel fell, or Judea fell, because of the fight between the extremists and the Hellenistic, because they were not united against Rome. They were split, and because the country went to Rome. But this is kind of, unfortunately, really reminds me of what's going on right now, the division. But the other thing is that there is a medical explanation for the winning the Jews against the Greeks, and it is that there was flu, and the Greek army got all of them got sick with flu, and they had to retreat. So this was winter, and this is what could have happened. So because there is no way that the small band of guerrilla could really fight against the Greek army, which was huge.
The Vietnamese did it to us.
So I want to wrap us up. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Jordan, our tech angel. I want to thank Stephen for being there and helping to monitor the in-person. I want to remind you all to fill out the feedback form that will be provided for you, and to let you know that Days of Learning continues through Friday, and you can check the RS website for classes and to register. So wonderful to be with all of you. What a great discussion, and I'll look forward to seeing a lot of you back in person on Shabbat. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.
It's all about the lockers.
Simple math.
That's the
Sei gesund, be well.
Hi, everyone.
Sadducees, Pharisees, we can all agree about lockers.
That's wonderful.
Rabbi Jones, actually, they tried to kill us and we survived.
Right.